Okay, so my name's Bridget Cotter. I'm a lecturer at the University of Westminster. I teach political theory, and I've taught there for about 30 years. I was originally born in California, born and raised in the US, and I think from the time I was 16, I worked in lots and lots of different jobs, nothing remotely academic. And then when I was about 27, I was over here. I came here when I was 19, just because I wanted to travel, no other reason, and ended up going to university here when I was 27. And so that's when I first heard about Mary Wollstonecraft. I was writing an essay about Thomas Paine. Does anyone know who that is? Yeah, okay. If you're interested in Wollstonecraft, you probably know who Paine is. So I was writing an essay about him and kind of came across her name, and the only thing I knew at that point was that she'd written a book around the same time that Paine wrote his very influential Rights of Man, that she wrote one about the rights of women, and that's all I knew at that point. And I wasn't very interested in feminism, which completely changed after not very long of working in a career which was quite male-dominated. So my life kind of changed after that, for the better, mostly. Anyway, so I started a PhD and also started teaching. And when I started PhD, I worked for a professor who was writing a book on Thomas Paine. And it's called Tom Paine, A Political Life by John Keane. So I was his assistant. So in those days, my job was to collect books from the library because we didn't have, so any young people out there, we didn't actually have digital copies of anything. And I actually photocopied chapters of books. So that was one of my jobs. And so I had access to all these books, which were coming from the British Library. And I suddenly read huge amounts about this circle that was around Thomas Paine, particularly in this area, because I lived here. So I lived in Stoke Newington for about 10 years in the 90s. And I was so fascinated by this idea that Mary Wollstonecraft and Tom Paine and all these people kind of hung out around here, and here I was living here, and it was, I was very excited by that idea. And I remember I became really aware of the importance of dissenting religions to politics around the period of the French Revolution, and just that period in English history as well. And I remember walking around Stoke Newington and counting 12 churches, and I just kept finding them like round corners and behind things, and I was like, wow, there's this whole thing happening here, and it's been going on for a long time. So that was really interesting and quite important for my education, really. Around around Newington Green, there was this whole sort of group of people. There was this society called the Revolution Society, which you may know about, I'm not sure, but Richard Price was part of the Revolution Society. He was quite an important figure in it, and this was his place. So he was an important figure. Tom Paine was in it, Mary Wollstonecraft, and also the political philosopher William Godwin, who later married Mary Wollstonecraft, and they had a child together. So I just got very interested in this, and later, not too much long later, I started teaching political philosophy. So the first course I was given to teach was a sort of typical survey course that you find in universities in politics degrees, and they will be political theorists from Plato to Marx. So it was a survey of theorists from BC to the 19th century. And what I really noticed was there was a big gap. I mean, of course, there were no women on the list at all, but there was also a really big gap in the late 18th century. So there was nothing on the French Revolution at all. So it would sort of leap from the 17th century, the English Revolution, and then it would go, bing, J.S. Mill, which is 19th century. So there was a big gap, and I thought, this is a really important period, especially if we're looking for the foundation of our thinking today. We need to really look at the beginnings of liberal thought and democratic thought. So I added them as soon as I had the chance. I put Mary Wollstonecraft in, I put Tom Paine in, yeah, I still teach them whenever I get the chance, really. So, on to Mary. So, Mary Wollstonecraft was born into a middle-class family initially. Means they had some money. That was, somebody who had an inheritance but didn't have a lot of wealth. And she was second of 7 children. And her father was an itinerant farmer, which meant he traveled around and went to different farms and kept failing at these farms. So some people have described her family as a failed middle-class family because eventually he spent all the inheritance and then turned to drink and then became very abusive towards her mother. So life was not that easy for Mary. It wasn't a cushy middle-class existence. It was a sort of declining existence, really. So by the time she was about 19, she had to make her own living. And she really was completely determined to avoid that what she saw as a trap for young women, which is that they would have to resort to getting married in order to get financial security, and she didn't want to do that. So she resisted that in every way she could. And so she ended up doing all the kind of typical acceptable professions that a young lady was allowed to do from her kind of station, from her status. So she was a governess, a companion to a lady. She became a teacher. She tried to open a school here in Newington Green, and I think it maybe was here in this building. I'm not sure, on this site. Over there. Okay. Sometime you can show me. What was that? Nobody really knows. Yeah. That seems plausible. Okay, yeah. Newington Green School, yeah. Oh, okay, yeah. Well, anyway, it was around here somewhere. So anyway, she opened a school, and this was her attempt to become financially independent. She brought her sisters with her and her friend, and it wasn't very successful in the end. And so she did all these different jobs, and she ended up working for a publisher called Joseph Johnson, who published a lot of radical and dissenting English thinkers. In that period, she worked for him. She was sort of like a copywriter and a bit of an editor, and then eventually published her own things with him as well. And I think it was when she was around 27, she decided that she was going to try and make her living completely from writing. And this was a very bold thing to do. It was not seen as a suitable occupation for a young woman, an unmarried woman, or any woman really. And particularly because she used her own name. She didn't try to disguise the fact that she was a woman. She didn't use a pseudonym like most female authors have done, up until 100 years later, was still doing, really. So she was quite often viewed very negatively for a very long time, and I'll talk a bit about that later on. But it's really important, and I'm sure most of you agree if you're here, that to understand that Wollstonecraft was a groundbreaking feminist thinker, and her absence from political theory is, something that really should be corrected, because she's not only an interesting figure, but she's an important political theorist in her own right. And it wasn't really until the 20th century that she started to be claimed by feminists. So the suffragettes claimed her, some of them did, and felt that she was an inspiration for them. And then later on, she's been classed as the mother of first-wave feminism, or the mother of feminism, but quite often first-wave feminism. So in academia, there's a way of classifying feminisms as first, second, and third wave, or fourth wave even. And I don't find this classification very useful, but generally the first wave is seen as the attempt of women trying to get equal political and legal rights. Now, Wollstonecraft didn't actually argue for women to have the vote. I think she would like to, she would have liked them to be politically active, but that wasn't the focus of her writing, and that wasn't really what was really happening at the time. So So she didn't really argue that, but also I would argue that she made a lot of points that were seen as more second-wave feminist, and so points that went further than just giving women the vote or just giving them legal protections. She wanted all that, but she wanted more than that. So I think she was very advanced in her thinking, and in some ways she's been narrowed by trying to put her into these pigeonholes. And the other thing is that she's been largely, her thinking has been overshadowed by her life. So her life is really interesting. You know, it's unusual, it's controversial. She had a child out of wedlock. She lived with men, unmarried. She didn't want to get married at all. She ended up getting married at the very end when her daughter was nearly born. So she and Godwin sloped off to the registry office and got married, probably for practical reasons, but neither of them really believed in marriage. She felt that marriage was something that was very, very threatening for women. But she, you know, she was perhaps in love, and maybe that's why they did it. I don't know that much about that. But in any case, her life is very unconventional, and so either she was damned for that, for all the people who saw her as amoral, immoral, or else people are so fascinated in her life that they forget to think about her thinking and what's important about it. Because it's been very sensationalized, even by people who are friends to her and allies to her. Some people would say even her own husband. Okay, so these are quite a few of Mary Wollstonecraft's writings, but not all of them, but most of them. So I don't know if you can see these very well. It's a little bit hard to see with the relief sculpture here. So we've got her first book that was published in 1786 was Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. And then if you look here at the bottom, there was a novel called Mary of Fiction, and then original stories from real life, which is children's stories. And so this is what she was doing in the beginning. So in the late 80s, she was writing books about the theory of education. She was engaging with a political thinker called Rousseau. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, very famous Republican thinker, French or Swiss actually, but writing about 10 years before the French Revolution. So he was seen as an inspiration for the revolutionists. So she really liked Rousseau because he was a Republican, and that's what she was. And at that point, a Republican is someone who doesn't believe in monarchy, who thinks that humans should be self-governing. So it's a kind of democracy, but it's about self-government specifically. So it's not really an argument for any particular type of democracy. It's more about self-rule. And so they believed, the Republicans, what were called the radical English thinkers of that period, they believed that if you had a monarchy, you couldn't be self-ruling. There was always a risk of arbitrary power, even with a constitutional monarchy. So this is, they were very much against monarchy. They were Republicans, and that's what a Republican was. So forget about what you know about the American Republican Party, because that is not what we're talking about here. That's just a red herring for us in this conversation. So first of all, she was writing about education. And when the term education was used in that period, it meant something much bigger than going to school. So for most people, education was done at home or privately. For the very wealthiest, they were sent to public schools, which were boarding schools, which were not paid for by the state as they are now. That's not, it was what we call public school or private school. But for the most part, people were educated at home, and girls were educated at home, usually to do needlepoint and play piano, depending on their class, or maybe taught to be in service if that's the class they were from. But they weren't taught letters, they weren't taught sciences, and this is what Mary Wollstonecraft really wanted. She wanted girls to be taught and treated as if they were rational human beings. And this was a revolutionary idea for most people at this point. So this is what she was really focused on, is the upbringing of children. So when she used the word education, she meant upbringing in a much bigger sense than just going to school. But she did want girls to be formally educated, and hence her attempt to set up a day school in Newington Green. But later on, she started to get very involved in politics proper. So she wrote Vindication of the Rights of Men in 1791, and this was a response to Edmund Burke. Okay, so Edmund Burke was a political philosopher, an English political theorist, and also the MP for Bristol for a few years. And he was a Whig, so he was a reformist, which meant that he believed in change, but gradual change. But he wrote a diatribe against the French Revolution. And one of the people he actually wrote against was Richard Price. So again, this is very relevant for where we're standing right now. And Mary Wollstonecraft was so angered by what she read that she immediately sat down, and I think within a couple months wrote Vindication of the Rights of Men, just scribbled it out. And many people felt that it was so passionate and angry that it wasn't right. So Godwin didn't like it when he read it. He read it before he knew her. And then he met her, and he was very irritated by her because he was trying to talk to Thomas Paine at the time, and she kept talking over him. And he didn't like that, so he really didn't like her. Later on, they got married, so obviously they worked out their differences. But when he read the book, he said he didn't like it because it was too passionate, it was too angered, and he wanted everything to be very controlled. Yeah, and she writes a lot about being controlled too, but we see a lot of evidence that she was a very passionate person. How else could she do the things that she did? How else could she decide that she wanted to live this very difficult life, really, not succumbing to the usual choices that were given to women of her class at that time? So she wrote the first response to Burke, and sometime after that wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which was much more about women's rights, so I'll talk about that a bit later. There's a couple other texts. There's a later novel, and there's also travel writings. So she wrote a few travel writings, and she liked to make observations about people's character, about national character, and that kind of thing. That was quite a sort of typical thing to do at the time in travel writings. And she wrote for children, she wrote educational things, and she also wrote political theory. All right, so just to recap some of what I've already said, this period is, the historical context of this is the period of the George III monarchy. It's also an important period for English radicalism, and most of the English radicals started out just looking in the direction of a more Republican idea, or something more democratic, and then they increasingly supported the French Revolution, and that became very controversial. So they started to get a sort of, the term radical was used in a very negative way, and they started to get this reputation for wanting to be French. And this is what so angered people who wanted to keep Britain a constitutional monarchy. So they were very, very important for this group of English radicals was the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So very similar in some ways to the Bill of Rights in the American Constitution. And this idea of natural rights was really key to how they thought. So it was the English radicals were Republican, they defended or they attacked monarchy, and they also wanted the idea of natural rights, that every human is born with rights. They wanted that to be recognized. And they wanted it recognized in writing, in law. So those are the key things that they were really arguing for. And also, they believed in reason. They believed that humans were inherently reasonable. Now, all these ideas are really familiar to us. They're pretty much what we base our thinking on today. But at that point, they weren't. I mean, they were very controversial. So there's, this is what's called the revolution and controversy, and these are 4 examples of this controversy, and for me, the most important ones. So the first thing that happened was that Richard Price gave a speech called A Discourse on the Love of Country. And he He did it here, I think, if this is the site, the meeting house. And that was in 1789, and he declared, a desire that countries should be conducted according to, that government should be conducted according to the principles of reason, that that men should have rights, that we should be self-governing. It was anti-monarchist as well. So it was a very controversial idea, and this speech was very angered a lot of people we might today call conservatives. And one of those people was Edmund Burke. So Burke is the second person, and his response to this, he was responding to someone who wrote him a letter and said, "Oh, I heard about Dr. Price's wonderful lecture, and I'm sure as a friend of liberty, Mr. Burke, you must really agree with him." And so Mr. Burke says, "No, I do not agree with him." And he wrote this extremely long letter. It's like 250 pages of letter with no chapters or anything, any sections or anything. So it's quite a difficult read. And he's got very flowery language, but he was an interesting thinker. And what he does in that book, one of the things he does is actually say that we don't need the rights of men here. What we need is the rights of Englishmen or the rights of Frenchmen. So we need rights that are conferred by states. We don't, this idea of, yes, they may exist, maybe something like a rights of man exists, but what use is it? And he's got a point, actually, when we think about it today. He's got some really interesting points in that book. He says that rights are inherited. They're inherited like property. And he uses this phrase called it's an entailed inheritance. Our rights, our liberties as Englishmen is an entailed inheritance. And I don't know if you've watched Downton Abbey or anything like that, but the idea of entailed inheritance is that you inherit a property and you're not allowed to actually change it too much. So yeah, you can change the curtains, but you're not allowed to start like messing around with the rooms, or the outside of it. It's listed. So that's what entailed is. Entailed means that you inherit it, it's yours, but it's yours to take care of for the duration of your lifetime until you pass it on. It's not yours to change or sell off or divide up. Yeah? So that's what entailed inheritance is. So Burke has this idea that our rights are an entailed inheritance like property. And we hand them down. They're handed down to us from our forefathers, and we hand them down to our children. And we may tinker here and there with things, but generally it's the continuity that really matters. And he felt the French revolutionaries were just throwing out the baby with the bathwater. They were pulling up the tree by its roots, whatever other metaphors you want to think of. He was very much against it. And so his book it started out saying that England can't be like France. We can't have a revolution here. We have a constitutional monarchy. It's perfectly good. It's that whole representation of conservatism as being, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's sort of Burke, and he's seen as the father of modern conservatism for that reason. And this book is seen as like the book to represent that. So those are his views, and he started out saying that it's not good for England, but he ends up denouncing revolution in general. So revolution is not a good idea. You're throwing away your traditions, and you need your tradition. So laws in England are based on tradition. That's his whole point. So Wollstonecraft comes in with her very angry reply and explains why humans are rational and should have rights and should be self-governing, and the whole argument. And then Thomas Paine, a little while later, does exactly the same thing, but a book that's much bigger and much more important and paid much more attention to, and in fact got him tried in absentia. So he was in France and he was tried for treason and would have been, I've heard a story that he did come back for a bit and hung out with Blake and then went back, and I don't know how he did it, but nevertheless, he really couldn't publicly come back to England ever again because he would have been executed. So that's the revolution controversy in a little nutshell. Can I have the next slide, please? So I don't know if you can see this very well, but this is a Gilray cartoon, and I love these cartoons. So there's Cruikshank and Gilray, and there are others who wrote satirical cartoons, and they're very conservative. They're always sending up radicals. So in this case, we've got Dr. Richard Price at the desk, and here it says treatise on the effects of ordered government society, and so we see his writings and kind of those things, and then the man with the big nose coming out of the cloud is Burke, and it says Reflections on the Revolution. He's there holding the cross and the crown, the symbols of England. So this is a bad dream of Dr. Price, having Burke come to him, and it's called Smelling Out a Rat, or the Atheistical Revolutionist Disturbed in His Midnight Calculations. And another interesting thing about this is that a lot of philosophy at the time, particularly what we might call liberal philosophy or the radical Republican philosophy, it took a very scientific approach in terms of the language it used. So it used the same kind of language as science did, as the natural sciences, because it believed that you could actually design government according to almost scientific, rational principles. And this is one of the things that Burke was really against, because he said humans aren't really that rational, they're actually quite passionate, and you need rules to keep them in check. Again, some people might say he had a point, but nevertheless, this idea of midnight calculations, and it's actually underlined, is really important, because it's the idea that to calculate how society should be is, for a conservative, a very bad idea, because you're trying to treat politics as a science when the reality is that it's an art. It's something that you have to, do very carefully and cautiously, and it's not something that you can calculate. So this was using that kind of language as a way of saying, we can't treat, it's not like a natural science. It's a very different thing. Okay, next slide, please. Here's another one. These are about Thomas Paine. Unfortunately, they never lampooned Mary Wollstonecraft, and I suppose it was because she was a woman, so not worth lampooning. But here's one where Thomas Paine, who was trained when he was young as a corset maker. That was his first. He was an apprentice until, when he was 12, he became an apprentice until he ran away because he didn't want to do that. But here he is trying to fit a British woman into a French corset. So we wouldn't know that, but that's apparently what you would see at that period of time, that's what he's doing. So it's the idea of trying to fit Britain into, using the principles of the French Revolution on Britain. And here he is taking the measure of the crown. All right, next slide, please. All right, so now we can move to Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women. This is a portrait by John Opie. He did a couple of paintings of her, and they're the most famous and the ones that you see all the time. So I like this one because she's reading a book. So this is the original title page for her book, The Rights of Women, with strictures on political and moral subjects. So I don't know if you could read the top, but it says the mind has no sex. So that's one of the things that Wollstonecraft says in the book, is the mind has no sex. So this is a very important aspect of her thinking, is that she's trying to argue that women are rational just as men are, and therefore there's, although it's a recognition that our bodies are different and that there are many things perhaps that women go through that men don't go through or whatever, nevertheless, the mind itself has no sex. Now, this is quite controversial now. A lot of people would argue that men and women do actually think differently, and it's genetic. And that's a different, many of us would disagree. But this is one of the biggest controversies within feminism. And she is one of the first people to actually try to say that, to make that idea that gender is constructed by people. It's not natural, or at least the norms. So your body, how your body is, should not determine what you can do for a living, because you're capable of thinking and reasoning, and therefore you're capable of learning, and you're capable of being any profession that you have the capacity and the knowledge to do. And so that's really what her argument is, because she was very frustrated by the limited range of things that women were allowed to do and learn. And so this is the main argument for this book. She's against all forms of arbitrary power. And this included the power of men over women. And she says, I do not wish for women to have power over men, because a lot of people would say that. If you expressed a feminist view of any kind, they would say, oh, you're just trying to swap here and become the rulers. And she said, I don't wish for women to have power over men, but I wish for women to have power over themselves. And so the whole idea was that every person, every rational being should have power over themselves. So if you think about the idea of a sovereign or of sovereignty, personal sovereignty means you have the ability to decide what you want to do. Yeah? And if you're a good person, in her view, you do that rationally, and that means that you end up doing it according to a set of moral principles. You think about other people. You have a set of morals to guide you, wherever that happens to come from. It may come from a religious creed or something else. So she believed that, that humans are capable of goodness and are capable of responsibility towards each other because they're rational. And so every person should have that ability to have that sovereignty over themselves to a very large extent. Obviously, we do need government for some things, but this is the most important thing, is that humans are capable of independence of thought, and so they should be able to have independence of thought. Okay, so she makes a lot of arguments in it that women are, because a lot of the reasons that are given for why women couldn't be involved in politics or couldn't teach or couldn't learn the sciences, for example, a lot of the arguments were about women being irrational. So women, they would point to examples of women being frivolous, or women being preoccupied with the way they look, or something like that. And therefore, women couldn't learn. And in fact, women were needed to perform other functions in society, so they shouldn't be doing this kind of, they shouldn't be learning in the same way. Okay, so one of her main arguments is that it's society that makes women seem like they're not wise, or they're not virtuous, or they're not rational. And so if you make women free, they'll quickly become wise and virtuous. That's another quotation from the book. And the longer quote there, which I think you can't read because of the moulding on the wall, says that in order to account for the use of tyranny, man makes many arguments to prove that the two sexes in the acquirement of virtue ought to aim at attaining a very different character. So some of this idea is aimed at Rousseau, because Wollstonecraft very much admired Rousseau's republicanism and his arguments that sounded democratic and were about self-rule. But he wrote a book about education. She agreed very much with most of what he said about how to educate a child. It was a much more sort of fulsome way of educating children. But in the 5th chapter, he writes about how to educate girls. And girls should be educated very differently, according to him, because they're suited for one role. And that's, as a support to, as a wife, basically, a support to a husband, to a male citizen. So she says, they make a lot of interesting arguments, and they seem very convincing. And so Rousseau says, a man's virtue is in being a good citizen, in having civic virtue, in having a great responsibility towards others. These are all the Republican kind of principles that he's professing. But a woman's virtue lies in being a good mother and a good wife. So it's this idea that we have very separate trajectories in what we're meant for. And Wollstonecraft's arguing against that. So a lot of what she does in the book is just that. Next slide, please. Okay, so she had a very poor reception at the time for this, for everything that she said. She made, all of her arguments were viewed very poorly by people at the time. And generally they tended to pick on her personal life. So when she died, Godwin, nobody really understands completely why he did this, but he put out all her letters, including love letters that she wrote, which put her in quite a bad light. She looks very pathetic to someone she loved who was ill-using her. So it was the father of her first child. And so, she looks very bad in these, especially if you look at the time. And I'm sure she never meant for these letters to be public. But he just wanted everything she ever wrote to be published. I think, it was kind of an act of love, but it wasn't the time for it. So it went down very badly, and people used her private life against her, but generally they just disagreed with her views as well. So, for example, Horace Walpole, a writer, referred to her as a hyena in petticoats. And what he's doing there actually is comparing her. So he said this in a letter to a woman called Hannah More, who was one of the blue stocking group at the time. And he's making a comparison, saying, "You're an excellent woman. You're a proper woman. Nothing like that Mary Wollstonecraft, that hyena in petticoats. She's not a proper woman. She's unfeminine. She has no feminine sympathy." He says a lot of very negative things about her. So there's a quote there. It says, and that's from a separate thing, which is a poem, which is written at the time as well, called "The Unsexed Females," a poem, and this is a poem about a great many different female radicals, and also about French women in general, because some people believed that the French women were particularly, they were sensual, they were frivolous, they had loose morals. And so almost anyone who also sympathized with the French Revolution also had loose morals. They used this kind of metaphor, particularly on the women that were in the English radical band. So this quotation from the poem says, "Survey with me what never our fathers saw, a female band despising nature's law, as proud defiance flashes from their arms and vengeance smothers all their softer charms." So he's arguing that any woman who speaks up and who supports these radical ideas and who tries to talk about women's rights, any woman like that is unfeminine and should not be listened to because she's also immoral. So that was a very, very typical kind of way of portraying women like Mary Wollstonecraft. This to a large extent, this still happens today. Practically any woman who says anything remotely feminist in the press will definitely get trolled. So even things like when the campaign, nice North London ladies campaigning to have, a statue of Mary Wollstonecraft on the green, or Jane Austen on a £10 note, they get trolled. They get rape threats in the comments on social media. And that is what you get if you speak out. And I think that's one of the things we learned from Mary Wollstonecraft. She didn't stop speaking out. She just kept doing it anyway. It's like she couldn't stop herself no matter what they said about her or did to her. But I think you learn that there's always going to be a backlash, no matter, if you express an opinion that people don't want to hear. they're going to use the artifices that are already there. And that's one of the main things for her, is that there was already this very intact idea about what was proper for women, which to some extent still exists today. And that can always be drawn on to try to silence women, or silence anybody who's in a position of oppression or in a position of disadvantage in any situation. So you can always call on those kind of edifices, that inequality that already exists. So just to go, I think for me the important lessons, I found this really interesting, this picture, because it's an older picture of her. She's, I don't know, it was painted by Keenan, and I'm not sure when it was painted, but she's an older woman, and I'm not sure if she ever really looked like that. It's interesting, though, that the different portraits you get of her, but most people, the images that you see all the time are the ones that most people seem to accept are the ones that really look like her. And in fact, the one where she's got the white top, I think, is the one that Godwin had over his fireplace. And if he liked it, then it must have looked like her. So we can judge it from that. This looks a little bit like her, but not entirely. So I would say that just to kind of recap some of what I've said, but probably I haven't said it very explicitly. I think the lessons that we've learned from Mary Wollstonecraft are that, one, existing gender norms are used to silence women, so that's one of the things. Second, gender norms are socially constructed, so what is acceptable for a woman is socially constructed, it's not natural. And although we take that for granted now, I think there's still a big element of that happening in different ways now, even though it's not the same as it was when she was around, it's still there. Another thing, education is political. So her argument that about the kind of education that children, and that particularly girls, should receive, showed that upbringing and education are a political thing for her, and arguing for kind of a good kind of education is a political act. And then finally, freedom is independence of mind. It's the ability to rule yourself, to think for yourself, and to use your own conscience and decide for yourself how you're going to live. So that's all I have for you. And I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bridget. That was very educational and interesting. Thank you. There are a couple of questions already. Hi, thank you. I just wanted to know, you mentioned some second wave feminism principles that she already showed in her work and her life. What were those?
What, the main principles?
Yeah, the second, you said there were, these categories, first wave feminism, second wave feminism.
Right.
And
right.
I was just wondering what aspects of second wave feminism.
I didn't really emphasize that, yes. One of the things is that there's another figure called Simone de Beauvoir, who was a French existentialist thinker in the 40s, really. And she's often seen as the mother of second wave feminism. The mother is the one who comes way before the wave. So the wave is in like the 70s. That's the period of second wave. And so second wave feminism is really usually characterized by women trying to get equality in other fields, not just legally and politically. So it's about women trying to get equality in the workplace, get access to more careers, to change certain laws about property, for example, so that it's easier to get divorced and women can own property and they didn't have to have their fathers sign their mortgages anymore, and all those kind of things. So she was already arguing that stuff. She was definitely arguing about property, about the ability for women to enter different professions, etc. But I think her argument about gender being constructed, the idea that the mind has no sex, was already a very important idea that was attributed to de Beauvoir, which is that gender is socially constructed. So she said, de Beauvoir's quote is, it's translated from the French, so it's a little bit hard to understand for some people, but she said, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. And it's the idea that you become a woman through your training, through your upbringing, through your education in the broadest sense. And you learn how to do female, basically. It's not something that's going to happen necessarily naturally. And so that point was made very well in her book, The Second Sex, but Mary Wollstonecraft already made that point before. So that's really, yes. Thank you for asking that.
I have a question as well. It was related to that. I found it interesting that you said that she was already a second wave. She was actually having the second wave feminism ideas. And I'm just wondering, because I heard that she was criticized for being not a criticism, but known for being an equal rights feminist rather than gender feminist. But the way you explained it really well, it's her kind of discourse about gender being a social construct already. Mind does not have sex is actually more suited to the second wave feminism, doesn't it?
No, that's absolutely true. And I think it's partly because the reason that this has happened, where she's described in that way, I think it's partly because the suffragettes claimed her as an inspiration. And, the suffragettes are a very particular type way of thinking. They had one main aim, and so it was quite narrow, and it's very liberal. In terms of, the system is fine, we just want to be included in it. And I think Wollstonecraft, the kind of changes she was looking for, in some ways are like that. I want to be included in what men have. But I think that the idea that the mind has no sex goes beyond that. And I think her idea that women should be able to be any profession, be doctors, whatever, should be able to learn in that way, as much as they want. She wanted to learn, and evidently she had access to books, so she was lucky, really, in that respect. But, she wanted girls to have that ability as well. And I just think that anytime you're writing about upbringing and saying that women are the way they are because they're taught to be that way, you're already breaking down a really basic assumption. And I don't think the suffragettes really needed to do that to make their argument. They, to some extent, but they still, they were very proper ladies, most of them. I know they took some very radical action, but, look at the way they dressed. It was very modest. It was very, there was a particular agenda, and it was pretty narrow. So I think she was different from that already.
So actually my question is related to that. It's, do you think that William Godwin's kind of depiction of Mary in his book has an influence why suffragettes did not take it on, her ideas?
I don't know if they want, I feel like she was a symbol for them. I think that did stop a lot of people from using her ideas. And it still continued to do that. And that's why I think they didn't wholeheartedly take everything. She was more of a symbol for them. But yeah, I think that's an uncomfortable thing. I don't think they all liked her because they had that view of her. They had that information about her life, or his version of it. It was, he really didn't do her any favors. Just put a magnifying glass on various things. But, maybe he was trying to say, look, she lived her own way. But, I read a quote from that, from the one who wrote the unsexed poem, and he said, basically there's a quotation which shows that he felt she deserved to die in childbirth, because that is what happened to her. She died of septicemia, giving birth, 10 days after Mary Shelley was born, or Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, her daughter, who became Mary Shelley later on. But yeah, he was saying, well, this is what you get if you behave like that. And I think, that has a very long shadow, that idea. But I don't know whether that has anything directly. If I were a historian of that period, the suffragette period, I would look into that, because it's an interesting question.
Davis has a question.
Thanks for that. It was very informative, and it helped me to understand more about her, Mary Shelley. In the history of the first wave and second wave feminism, unfortunately today there's a kind of a crisis for feminism, especially in the poisonous atmosphere when it comes to trans women.
Yes.
Where would Mary Wollstonecraft have stood if she if she saw what was happening today?
I think the answer to that question would make a really interesting science fiction movie, but there's no way we could know that. And I think she would just think it was very strange. But then we don't know. We don't know how many. We don't know whether there were trans people around, or the extent to which they were around, and the extent to which other people knew about them, and how accepted they were. It might be much more widespread than we know. So I don't know. She had a lot of experience. She did travel a lot. Her writing career is only like 10 years long, and she died when she was 38. But she went to quite a lot of countries, and went to Paris all by herself, and had an illegitimate daughter who she took around wherever she went, and she did what she wanted, basically, and she traveled a lot. So you kind of think she must have been exposed to a lot of things. So I don't know, but I think we can, when you ask a question like that, what would so-and-so, what would Plato have thought of this? God knows, I don't know. But yeah, it's a really difficult thing, because the whole, there's a lot of modern issues that challenge a lot of the assumptions made by feminism. So one of them, I think, that is obviously a really big one, the idea of trans women and identifying as a woman, and women-only spaces, and the history of feminism, and the need for women-only spaces for very clear reasons. It is a difficult issue. I have no idea how to solve that one. As a feminist, I don't know what to say about that. But I'm in education, and we have to respect people as they identify, and that's how we do it in the university, for example. But I understand both sides of it. But yeah, I'm speechless about it.
Women disguising themselves as men and going off to fight in the Napoleonic Wars, weren't there, for example?
Yes, I'm sure those kind of things happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Who would today have been trans, probably.
Yeah, I don't know if have you seen that Gentleman Jack thing?
Yes, absolutely.
Is that based on a real story? Or, yeah.
Yes, absolutely,
yeah.
yes. She was very, very real. It's based on her diaries.
Yeah, so these aren't like one-offs. This is humans. This is what they do. That is some of what they do. So, she may have been aware of people like that. Who knows? Maybe Tom Paine was really a woman. Thanks for coming. Any other questions?
Would you consider... I've just attended a bicycle tour commemorating and visiting places of interest for the ride was entitled Radical Rose, R-A-D-I-C-L-E, Radical Rose, which contributed to my vocabulary. I didn't know. I thought it was radical in the traditional sense.
Okay,
It
yeah.
was very interesting, mainly about suffrages, but particularly about her. Interestingly, she lived where Birkbeck School is now, which is the first school accepted, well, one of the first women, 25 years after Wollstonecraft's efforts, I guess. And I was impressed the way they worked, because they had the wisdom of introducing cycling into women's life, and they transformed clothing. They introduced trousers, for instance, which
really?
is in the time called
Yeah.
revolutionary. And also they planted trees well before we had this madness of concrete buildings surrounding us.
Yeah.
But what you have explained earlier on about the difference is also very interesting. This whole thing tells me that it would be really good if you could continue this, either as a series. Maybe you could introduce Wollstonecraft in several workshops in a slower manner to those who are interested in details, and compare. Maybe one part of that series could be comparison to suffragettes.
Yeah.
It may address more people. I consider myself more a novice to feminism. I know little in detail. It may not be felt the same by everybody else, but this was very interesting. I was supposed to leave at 7 and couldn't.
That's really nice to hear, because I proposed a sort of public-facing course to the university. We do a few sort of public outreach type things, and I wanted to run something almost exactly like that. Not really just around Wollstonecraft, but a lot of different kinds of feminism. And they said, you really need to tell us who your audience is and who's going to take this course. So let me take your name.
My name is Gönül. I'm actively contributing for a campaign currently. It's London Cycling Campaign's Women's Network. And we would love to consider inviting you for a webinar maybe for a wider audience.
I'd consider it, sure. I used to be in the London Cycling Campaign.
It's the number of women cycling in the streets of London, which is nearly a third of their ratio in the society.
Yeah, I used to be in that campaign. Yeah. When I don't live here anymore. I live in Brighton now, so I don't live in London. But sure. Yeah, sure. Okay. Anyone else? Oh my God. Yeah, that's
Oh,
true.
we can have you back here
Don't
for
know. I
a
might
couple
have
of more
a career
lectures.
as a public academic now. Oh, thank you. Wow. This has been really fun for me, so thank you so much for inviting me.
Great, thanks for coming all the way from Brighton. Yeah,
No problem. It's so nice to visit the old neighborhood too.
yeah,
actually.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So any other questions?
This one is, I think it's George Keenan. Yeah, I mean, some of the portraits that claim to be her, I'm not convinced they are her. But this one is supposed to be her, and there's a description of it, which I read, about how she sort of looks almost slightly annoyed to be interrupted in her reading. Well, I mean, I think it is. I'm wondering if it was after she died. I mean, was her hair grey? She does. She's different from how she usually is. So yeah, so I really don't know. I did a lot of looking for pictures of her, and some of them seemed a bit questionable to me. Yeah. But I found that really interesting, because I got very interested in all the cartoons and the depictions of various people, and yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's some great ones of pain. Okay.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming, and thank you very much, Dr. Bridget Cotter, for your lecture today.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having me.